in our series of 6 office hours dedicated to implementation of new transportation analysis metrics related to development in the state of California. My name is William Walker. I'm an associate planner with OPR. We're going to give folks a couple minutes. I mean, in the 20 seconds I've been speaking, 70 people have joined us. So give folks a few minutes to get situated. And we thank you for joining us this morning. Again, if you're just joining us, we're going to take another minute to let folks populate into the webinar room. This is Implementing Senate Bill 743, Methods for Other Land Uses. This is our topic for our June 3rd webinar. It's brought to you by the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, also known as OPR. If you're having any problems hearing us, this is your chance to let us know. I've also been advised that we are streaming live on YouTube. And if you need to let someone know that didn't get a chance to register, how to find us on YouTube, you can head to opr.ca.gov. So I'll welcome just once more everyone who's here to our webinar. And again, I'm William Walker, associate planner. I'm going to introduce the team that will be joining me every week for the last 3 weeks and continue to. Our senior advisor, our chief legal, our land counsel, myself, William Walker, and Alyssa Montanez, who's been our technical support, and she works here at the on special project. So very, very honored to work with this team of great individuals. We're going to be joined by you all throughout the state of California, and we're hoping to be a great support around implementing Senate Bill 743. What I'd like to do right now is introduce our Chief Legal Counsel, Jeannie Lee. She will start us off with an announcement.
Thank you, Will. And thank you all for joining the webinar. Before we begin, on behalf of our director, Kate Gordon, and all of OPR, we wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the grief and stress that so many people are experiencing right now, following the recent violent deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Monica Diamond, Tony McDade, and other Black Americans. These deaths and the unrest that has followed come as Californians continue to grapple with the devastating deaths and health impacts caused by COVID-19, as well as the economic impacts associated with the pandemic. Impacts which, like violent death, Black Americans and Black Californians experience at a far higher rate than other groups due to long-standing structural and institutional racism, which we must continue to expand our efforts to address and eradicate. We acknowledge the disproportionate pain and burden Black Californians bear and urge all of us to work together every day for an equitable, just society. Again, thank you for joining us today for this 743 webinar, and I'll hand it back to you, William.
Great, thank you, Jeannie. I also just want to add that we are socially distanced. We understand that that we're in, we're to places, and there's a lot going on. So we're doing our best to stay healthy and safe, and we hope that you all are doing so for families as well. I'd like to introduce Chris Ganson. He is our Senior Transportation Advisor for OPR and will be the lead panelist or the lead. You're our orator, our host, you're everything.
Answer
right
your
now.
questions.
And I'm here for questions and all of that. Chris, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Will. Thanks for kicking us off. Thank you, Jeannie, for acknowledging where we are right now and with an eye on where we need to be and what we need to do to get there. I'll just mention briefly that we're on the third, I'll reiterate really, Will shared this, that we're in the third of a webinar series. Next week, we're gonna have a legal focus, talk about issues of timing, tiering, other legal topics. And then we are going to look back at the questions we've answered and look at what continued questions we have and determine what best, if any, topic to focus on for the last two webinars, June 17th and June 24th. So today we're going to be discussing approaches for studying VMT for other land uses other than the ones that we've provided guidance for in our technical advisory. So those other land uses, there's just a few of them: industrial, warehouse, hotels, school, event centers, religious uses, waste. We can go beyond that. It's just a sampling. Just want to talk a little bit by way of background. Why wouldn't we just have included in our advisory, technical advisory, information on how to study and set significance thresholds for these projects? Well, in a nutshell, there's a large number of land uses, and it would be impossible for us to provide guidance on each. And two, there's variety in those land uses. Industrial in one jurisdiction might look quite different than industrial for another, for example. So we're going to use today to discuss these. We may not provide. Sorry, it looked like you lost my slides there for a sec, but it looks like we're still on. We may not be able in every case to provide a definitive approach to get to the every last detail of how you might carry things forward, but at least we hope to provide some principles for moving forward and hopefully flesh out some of the details working with you all. So I'd like to start with the approaches that we have recommended for the land uses we in the technical advisory for residential, office, and retail in particular. So what we recommend as a starting point for other land uses, looking at the recommendations for these land uses and using that as a starting point. So just to briefly recall, and if you haven't looked in depth, we recommend taking a look at the technical advisory or the sections of the webinars that we've done. They're posted on our YouTube channel, which describe methods and significance thresholds, determining significance thresholds for the for residential, office, and retail. And familiarize yourself with those methods because they are great starting points for examining VMT for other land uses. But just to review briefly, so we recommend for office and, well, there's two approaches essentially. One is to compare VMT to other similar projects, and the other is to examine the change in total VMT. So for residential and for office, we recommend comparing VMT to other similar projects. And in those cases, we recommend specific thresholds of significance, 15% below regional average, or for residential, city average, if you so choose. For retail projects, we recommend examining the total change in VMT. So looking at the VMT in the area across the area over which travel behavior is affected, looking at that without the project, and then modeling that with the project and seeing whether it changes, which direction it changes, and how much, and then basing the significance. And for retail, we recommend basing the significance threshold on whether it increases VMT or decreases VMT. And we point out that a lot of land uses, this will be true for other land uses as well, but a lot of retail will tend to reduce vehicle travel by providing a closer destination than people currently have to do their shopping, by providing better accessibility or access to destinations, as we call it in transportation. So it's also important to reflect on the purpose of CEQA, what we're up to here, what we're doing, which from the Newhall Ranch decision is not to limit growth, but rather to grow efficiently. If using this first approach, comparing VMT to other similar projects, it makes sense in an urban region where people are making residential location choices, roughly speaking, to live in the region, and where they live in the region is the choice they're making. Then it's important to inform ourselves with the transportation efficiency of that, inform ourselves of the transportation efficiency of that choice when we build new residential. In speaking from last week's office hours, we talked about rural development. That's not exactly it is not exactly the case in rural areas, where even a residence might be a new residence in the middle of a small town that has very low VMT, or it might be a house on a farm, which serves different purposes. Essentially, they're both residential, but the purposes are somewhat different. So it might be, that's why we offer, why we recommend that you consider thresholds on a case-by-case basis in rural areas. So similarly, there needs to be some opportunity to consider thresholds of significance and methods, for that matter, even for other land uses on a case-by-case basis, or to tune them to your what's on the ground in your jurisdiction, or broadly speaking, the context. We'll try and provide some examples. Hopefully you guys, I shouldn't say provide some examples, but work on some of the examples that you all bring to the table. We'll also take general questions and couple more thoughts before we open the floor up. Again, this is, if you've watched our other webinars and office hours, you've probably seen this slide, but just want to reiterate that it's easy to think black and white as we deploy 743 and a high VMT bad, low VMT good. Well, that's not the way CEQA thinks when you look closely. CEQA is looking at an impact, and it sees projects that are low impact, and there's not a finding of significance, and so no mitigation is needed, and those kinds of projects are streamlined. So with VMT, a project that's naturally low VMT would be streamlined, and projects that are higher VMT but that can be mitigated to less than significant, those also, of course, can proceed with that mitigation. And projects that mitigate VMT as feasible but can't reduce VMT to less than significant may still proceed with a statement of overriding consideration. So, and as I've said before, it'll be important for us to get more low VMT projects, and important for us to get the VMT reduction out of the mitigation for the second and third kind of project. That's important for our climate goals, important for our other environmental goals, important for our the health of the citizens of our state. And just one more review, which is that generally under 743, we're not talking about freight vehicles, about heavy duty trucks or medium duty trucks. We're talking about passenger vehicles, cars, SUVs, light duty trucks in transportation terminology is what SUVs are called. And that is stated in the guidelines and clarified in the technical advisory. You can refer to it on those pages if you like. So that's just some starting information. And let's go ahead and take a look at what questions we have. Again, I invite you to ask questions, any questions about the other land uses, the ones we haven't provided detailed guidance for, detailed advisory language for. And I also would offer the opportunity to share projects, hypothetical or real, for us to grapple with together to discuss. So I'll open the floor up there. Will, if there's a question, and while you're doing that, I will see pulling up the chat box, or is it Natalie?
I will ask the questions. Will is fixing his audio issue. Thank you.
Oh, right. Yeah, I heard
for,
it was
attendees for pointing that out. So our top question is on construction VMT analysis. How would OPR recommend addressing construction VMT qualitatively for a project that would make improvements to an existing water treatment plant in a city that currently has not adopted VMT thresholds for screening?
Right. So, you know, I don't know. I know that some of some cities have adopted approaches. Some cities that have proactively made the shift to VMT have adopted thresholds of significance. I'm not sure whether all of them have, and probably I'm not sure about this, but I would suspect none of them have provided threshold of significance for every possible project. I'm sure there's some in any jurisdiction where you might need to develop those for a certain project that you haven't provided them for already. So that I'm not sure it's too relevant whether the city has developed significance thresholds already, but in any case, the qualitative, so first off, we recommend, and I believe it's in the guidelines themselves, that a qualitative approach might be the best for construction impacts, particularly where construction impacts, but particularly, but not only, where construction impacts are likely to be dwarfed by the actual operations of the project, at least over time. Let's see, I don't have a lot to go on, but it sounds like there's Natalie, it was a water project?
There's an existing water treatment plant
Okay.
going to be improved through this.
Okay, right. So I mean, it's hard without a little more information about it to say much about how you might do the analysis. I'm assuming there will be some, if it's a water treatment plant, there will need to be construction vehicles bringing some supplies. Again, those vehicles wouldn't be addressed under the transportation analysis. They would be addressed under the air quality and other analyses, but they would, as always, but they wouldn't be addressed under the transportation analysis. There might be some commute travel associated with construction, but perhaps not. That might need to be described. Trying to think of what else I can say from what's been shared. But I'll start there, and if there's a follow-up question, please share with us.
Great, thanks. So yeah, Shade Rosenblum, if you have additional details you'd like to provide, please do that. The next top question is from Zachary Miller. Can you please address park and rec projects, more specifically larger state or regional park projects? Often the purpose of these projects is to improve facilities and increase visitorship.
Increase, sorry, what?
Visitorship. So
right.
more visitors coming to the park.
Right. So starting with the two approaches that we have that we provided guidance for, one comparing to other projects, similar projects, or two, looking at the total amount of VMT. I would say, there's perhaps the option to go either way. The more obvious option to me would be the looking at the total amount of VMT with and without the project. So people, when a project goes in, and this is certainly true for retail, and it's probably true, this would be the thing to consider, with a park, people weren't just, with retail, people weren't just sitting at home, they actually, well, these days we're sitting at home, but generally, people were shopping, and then a retail store opens up, and they change their shopping patterns. It might be that the store is closer, so it's more convenient, or it might be that it's further away, but it's a big volume discount store, and so people increase their vehicle travel. So what we're looking at is whether you decrease or increase your vehicle travel, and by how much. So for a park, regional or otherwise, the question would be, through this lens, whether what people were doing beforehand. Were they traveling to a regional park that's further away, having to drive more to get their recreational opportunities in? Were they going to some other location that was further away, or were they before visiting their local park, and this is drawing them out to a further location by car? And then I don't know if this is part of the question, but there might be mitigation opportunities. It might make sense to include a bus stop so that people can get there by transit. It might be possible to, in non-COVID times, encourage pooling using one of the many emerging pooling apps. There are an array of VMT reduction possibilities. It might make sense to reduce the amount of parking so that people aren't encouraged, drawn to arrive by car. Just some thoughts there. Let's go ahead and take the next one.
Great, thanks, Chris. So our next top question is about a hotel project. Would we calculate a separate VMT for employees versus guests of the hotel? Or do we need to analyze guest VMT since it varies, or do we not need to analyze, guest VMT since it will vary on a day-to-day basis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. I think for taking that last part first, so I don't think that a variation is a justification for not considering an impact. VMT no different than any other. A lot of impacts will be seasonal. A lot of natural environment impacts are seasonal. A lot of VMT impacts, for example, in tourist areas, will be seasonal, and those do need to be considered. So on the question of whether to calculate VMT separately for employees or guests, that's certainly one pathway. Jumping from our recommendations on mixed use development, where we recommend looking at each use separately, that again, and going back even a step to kind of the principle of CEQA helping us guide or informing us so that we can provide a development that's environmentally efficient, that serves people but doesn't do environmental damage. That's the point. And again, what we're taking out of the Newhall case. So one option, would be to look at the employees and separately the guests. Another might be that if it looks like one or the other dominates, I'm guessing it would be the guests in this case, then it could make sense to consider that we recommend for mixed use projects considering the dominant use alone. And then if you wanted to, you can consider the other travel qualitatively, but focusing again on the efficiency of the efficiency of the dominant type of vehicle travel on the project, which I would imagine for a hotel would generally be guests. So let's take another one.
Okay. So earlier you mentioned qualitative analysis. So we have a question about what do you mean by a qualitative analysis and what might go into a qualitative analysis?
Gosh, I'm gonna have trouble answering this in the abstract. I don't know whether you, Natalie, or Jeannie have any answers to this, but it's going to depend greatly project by project, like what project type we're talking about. I mean, qualitative is not quantitative. It's characterizing the amount of vehicle travel, and you might characterize it as not significant compared. Like, for example, if you're looking at construction VMT impacts in the project, you might characterize them qualitatively as just not there's not a substantial amount compared to, it's negligible compared to the operational the VMT associated with operations of the project.
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add to that. Performance standards are often used instead of a hard number in terms of the number of vehicle trips, as Chris mentioned earlier, which would be a quantitative analysis. But please let us know if you have any additional facts or would like more information on that question. And that's Jamie Kennedy's question. Our next top question is about wineries and small scale tourism-based uses. Does OPR have suggestions for how these uses should be analyzed? So why don't we start with that? There's actually 3 parts to this question.
Okay, great, yeah. So wineries and smaller scale tourism uses. So there's even a wide variety of these, right? But I'll focus on wineries because it's what the questioner raises. So let's think again from the kind of 2 basic approaches of comparing to other wineries and looking whether the winery increases or decreases vehicle travel overall. So let's just go with the second approach. You're looking at whether the winery, because wineries are essentially they're more like retail than any of the other land uses. Probably the dominant vehicle travel is going to be that of patrons of the winery coming in, wine tasting, etc. So the approach then would be to look at the amount of vehicle travel in absence of the winery and then with the winery. And if the place in the winery, building the winery would draw more people a further distance, that would be an increase in VMT and might be considered a significant impact depending on how you approach the significance threshold. And if it's a winery that's in a location that's a little more convenient for people to get to, and it takes business from the wineries further afield, then it might reduce VMT. And in that case, it wouldn't have a significant impact. So I'll leave it there for the first part and start looking at the second part.
Yes, so the second part of the question is, visitor-based VMT is difficult to mitigate at an individual project level, particularly in rural areas. The most effective approaches require a regional approach. Does OPR foresee individual visitor-focused projects like wineries requiring EIRs due to VMT impacts until regional mitigation programs can be established?
Right. So yes, in many cases, and particularly and more often in rural areas than elsewhere, a visitor-based VMT may be difficult to there may be fewer options to mitigate VMT at an individual project level. Now, there's going to be a lot. I mean, Disneyland will have a lot of options if you already build a second Disneyland and do an assessment on it and mitigate. that there would be a lot of options, right? It's big enough that there's all kinds of things it could do, but there's things that even smaller projects can do. But you're right, there may be greater opportunity in VMT mitigation in banding together, whether it's at the regional level, whether it's back to the winery example, banding together with a group of local wineries, pitching in for a shuttle. So the regional mitigation program is not necessarily a formal regional mitigation program across the full region is not necessarily a prerequisite to banding together with others. But I would concur that in many cases it would benefit jurisdictions to pull together programs which various projects could participate in. And again, requiring EIRs due to VMT impacts until regional mitigation programs could be established. Not necessarily, it depends on all of these details, whether the winery, for example, increases or decreases VMT, whether whether they've found others to go in with, whether they've managed to mitigate on site, which might be possible in many cases. And the third question.
Yes, so third part of the question, would jurisdictions be able to set thresholds for these land uses that look only at employee-based VMT or only at the employee-based VMT component?
Yes, absolutely. If the employee VMT were the dominant VMT, that might be an appropriate approach for a lead agency to take to look at the employee-based VMT. If it were a land use that was assuming, well, we're talking here about tourism-based uses, and presumably in most cases, tourism-based uses, the main VMT, the bulk of the VMT associated with the project is going to be the tourists. I'm guessing that because it would be a tough business model to if you had fewer tourists than employees, and I'm guessing because they're tourists, they're possibly coming from further, although maybe they flew in. So yes, that would be appropriate where jurisdictions where the employee-based VMT were the dominant VMT, but it would be better to focus if another aspect of the VMT were dominant, then it would be better to look at primarily at that. And forgive the lawn care noises from the next door neighbors behind, if you can hear those. Hopefully those aren't making me too inaudible.
I can hear you, Chris.
Good.
All right. So our next top question is from Zachary Miller. The technical advisory states it clearly, but where in the guidelines does it state or imply that heavy duty vehicles don't need to be addressed in a VMT analysis?
I believe it discusses auto VMT. Unfortunately, I can't, because I have the slides up, I can't pull up something else on my computer, and that means I can't look at the guidelines language in real time. But I believe it refers to auto travel, and in the technical advisory, we interpret auto travel as to be light duty vehicle travel.
Great. Yes, so the CEQA guideline, which is 15064.3, states that vehicle miles traveled refers to the amount and distance of automobile travel attributable to the project.
Thank you.
Okay. And our next top question, do you have any thoughts on destination drive-through restaurant uses, i.e. In-N-Out, Dunkin' Donuts, or even Chick-fil-A? Even though the square footage are small, they often generate high volumes of trips. And if there are no or few of the same restaurant nearby, trip lengths are often longer than for other kinds of restaurants.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And that's a good point. Right, because a drive-through restaurant, some drive-through restaurants, even though they may be auto-oriented and not particularly urban design-wise, not particularly friendly to walkable urban fabric, they some and as you point out, there's exceptions. Some tend to just be pass-by trips. People don't actually go out of their way to them. They just happen upon the McDonald's. They're not going to travel 10 miles to a McDonald's. But as you point out, maybe they will travel 10 miles to a In-N-Out after, the 5th day in a row of staying home eating macaroni and cheese in these days. So right, square footages are small, but that's not necessarily relevant. I think that Rob raises that because we've traditionally looked at square footages, and the IT trip generation rates are often based on those, and so that may be a fairly incorrect way of looking at trip generation for uses where the there's actually quite a different effect than that would predict. I mean, essentially, we would recommend including these in retail and looking at whether they draw what change in VMT they create by being built. So taking the In-N-Out, the thing to sort out, I guess the basic one basic thing to sort out would be whether people are going out of their way to go to the In-N-Out, or whether they're just going to the In-N-Out on their way to other activities. So seeing whether the In-N-Out is actually increasing VMT, and then again, looking at maybe for some people it's providing a closer destination. So on balance, is the business going to increase or decrease vehicle travel? It's just that basic question. And this one actually, although it's a little bit of a twist, generally would fall in I would say the retail category, and under our recommendations in the technical advisory. So I'll stop there. Please follow up, Rob, if you have if you want me to address something further.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So our next question is from Chris Stewart. How do you calculate for VMT for public recreational uses? For example, soccer fields, parks, trail facilities, when you don't know the market that will use the facilities? Right.
Natalie and or Jeannie, I'll please correct me if I use if I don't use quite the right terminology here. But essentially, we sort of talked through this, the fundamentals of this. There's a question about parks. The additional question here is, but you don't know the market that will use the facilities. Now, this is not an uncommon problem for CEQA. You might also build a retail establishment that has space for businesses to come in, but you don't know what those businesses are going to be. You don't know whether that's going to be a clothing store or a restaurant or a Trader Joe's. So you have to make some assumptions, essentially. I can't provide much guidance on how to make those assumptions, but it's CEQA requires you to use the best available information. So it shouldn't smell like gaming it with a particularly low VMT use. And if you have an inkling or knowledge of what the project might be used for, and this includes for a recreational facility, then make your best estimate. So this is, in much of CEQA, not just with VMT, but certainly with VMT in some projects, it'll be important to just be able to do kind of the best maybe even back of the envelope work to tee up what the use is most likely to look like. And the other thing I would say is just show your work. That's always best to do in the CEQA context.
Great, Chris. Our next question is about freight from Keith Greer. If freight is not included in the technical advisory, would all expansions of freight not be considered in future EIRs for transportation impacts?
So the freight depends on what's meant by a freight, by an expansion of freight. If the expansion of freight is a new warehousing facility, then it would be important to examine the light duty vehicle travel, perhaps the worker commute vehicle travel to the facility. But you would not need to consider the heavy duty vehicle travel to the facility in your transportation impacts. You would need to consider that elsewhere in your EIR.
Great. Next question, how about land uses for hospitals and medical facilities?
Right, okay, so thinking about the recommendations we provided in the technical advisory, the compare to other similar uses, or look at the total change in vehicle travel. For a hospital, there's generally you can divvy it up into two pieces. One, there's the people who work at the hospital, the doctors, the administration, nurses, etc. And then there's the patients that are, from a VMT perspective, essentially like customers. This is one where you could consider it different ways. For a hospital, there may be enough employment at the hospital to justify considering explicitly the employee commute travel. And there's probably enough patient traffic to consider patient VMT as well, visitor VMT or patient VMT. So this might be a case where you'd want to look at both, kind of like we recommend for mixed use projects. And you could consider the patient travel in the method, the way we use retail. So when you're providing an additional hospital, that'll give people a closer hospital to go to, that would tend to reduce VMT, and you tend to have a less than significant impact. You could, for the commute VMT, you could take that VMT together with other office VMT, but that may or may not be appropriate, given that, again, when you're using the method of comparing to similar land uses, you have to make a judgment call on what's similar enough. Are the kind of location choices involved in siting office development similar enough to the location choices around siting a hospital to use one significance threshold across both, or are they different enough that you'd want a different significance threshold for each?
Great.
I hope that answers that question.
Thanks, Chris. Our next top two questions are on the same topic about heavy duty vehicles. And what if the major portion of the project is heavy duty trucks? And there are a few examples given: truck terminals, warehouses, or delivery of fill for a sea level rise adaptation project, where maybe you would only have a few number of employees, but 200 to 300 truck trips per day.
Yeah. So even if they're the dominant, even if they dominate, the trucks dominate the vehicle travel generated by a project or attracted to a project, still they need not be considered in the VMT in studying the transportation impacts of the project. Again, they would those impacts would show up in air quality, greenhouse gas, noise analysis, et cetera. But no, they would not be VMT impact. Now you're not prevented from including them, but there is no expectation that you would. In some cases, I don't know about if this is a good, these questions are good examples of this, but in some cases there will be truck travel mixed in with car travel, and the model will have both together, and there's no requirement that you disaggregate them. Where they are taken together, the study can look at both together, but there's no expectation that truck travel will be examined. Truck travel VMT will be examined for transportation impacts. Thanks.
And I think this question is similar in terms of goods movement and a port expansion. Would that fall under the same?
Yeah, very similar. So let's see for
from Keith Greer, how would OPR suggest addressing goods movement?
Oh, right, yeah. We'd suggest addressing it in the other sections of the EIR. The goods movement is not going to be captured generally not going to be captured under 743. And then there's the question of interregional, which is a separate question, and generally vehicle travel that is interregional does need to be followed, but again, it's not necessary to examine or assess truck VMT under 743.
And then similarly, what about projects where the construction impacts are large, but the operational impacts are small, like an electricity plant, refinery, or where there's major modifications, but few changes in VMT following the completion of construction. For example, few or no new employees.
Right. So, it may be, so we do recommend the option of considering construction impacts qualitatively. And again, a lot of construction impacts are going to be a lot of the vehicle travel associated with construction is going to be heavy duty vehicle travel, which need not be considered. So just because construction is the only vehicle travel, construction vehicle travel is the only vehicle travel, doesn't indicate that it needs to be considered more carefully. That said, it's obviously a lead agency decision ultimately on whether to consider construction impacts in a qualitative manner or in a quantitative manner. But we provide that qualitative pathway as an option.
Thanks, Chris. So it looks like Shade has provided some additional clarification on her question earlier about construction VMT analysis. So for projects with construction VMT only, as we were just discussing, should they exclude heavy duty truck trips? Specifically, they're looking to meet the small project screening criteria. Then would you only look at construction worker trips, the commuters, and not the heavy truck trips to meet that 110-day?
Yeah. So again, ultimately, lead agency call, but under our recommendations, yes, you would not consider the truck traffic, and the screening threshold would apply to any remaining auto traffic, auto VMT, or auto trips rather, because the screening threshold's in trips.
Great. Another similar vein, how would you analyze VMT for a truck stop? Is it screened out similar to local serving retail?
That's a good question. So my first thought is that a truck stop is essentially a retail establishment. It's going to attract first, mostly trucks, so that VMT is not necessarily isn't relevant for a vehicle travel a VMT perspective under 743, but it may draw some customers that aren't in trucks. That might be worth considering. Also, a truck stop is going to generally be passed by. It's not going to, people don't generally, I think, go far out of their way to go to a truck stop. They go to a truck stop because it's right there at the exit on their way to somewhere else. So I would imagine that even, so true pass-by trips, as we call them in transportation, which don't add zero or negligible vehicle travel because people are already going somewhere and they're just stopping on the way. Essentially, that might be something that a lead agency would want to create a presumption of less than significant impact for. I'll stop there. It's not, we don't have recommendations for it to be screened out. We haven't articulated a recommendation or any recommendations for truck stops per se. But that's how I would think about it. And it would be the sort of land use that I would imagine a lead agency might develop a very simple, straightforward presumption of less than significant impact for.
Thanks, Chris. Next question. For a warehouse site, if the end user and HV destinations are known and the new location results in a net reduction of VMT for HVs, I'm guessing that's heavy duty vehicles, can that reduction not be used to offset the employee VMT, potentially resulting in a non-significant impact?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that there is an opportunity to offset some VMT with other VMT in particular, because we're not considering heavy duty VMT here. We're not considering heavy duty VMT. Let's see, for where is it? A net reduction of VMT. Yeah, I shouldn't say that there's not. I should say that because it's heavy duty. I think that I don't. I'm not sure that would work. I'll actually want to walk back what I said just a moment ago, which there may be the opportunity, if you're reducing VMT in one place, to count that towards to subtract that from your VMT increases elsewhere in the project. That's essentially what may happen on a larger scale when we get VMT banking put in place. I think that answers that question.
Okay, great. So we have a question that's not about construction or heavy duty vehicles.
All right, moving to schools.
Yeah, schools. This question is from Casey Kempen. How would you recommend analyzing charter schools that do not have set attendance boundaries? There does not appear to be a good source for data.
Right. So of course, data availability is key. But in this case, I would suggest that there are probably a couple potential good sources of data. One would be just surveying, running a survey at the school to see where people are living. And I guess if this is a future charter school, of course, you can't survey. So then it would be looking at other similar schools, but this is travel. So modeling, travel demand modeling, which we've been doing, and modeling VMT, which we've been doing for years and decades. It's kind of no different than what we've ever done. So you may be able to use surveys from existing charter schools to get a sense of how far people travel to them. You may be able to use big data, GPS based data, anonymized. There are some organizations that are making that available these days. So that's another option. And just like with any project that we've modeled, you then do your best work to extrapolate from what we do know to what we don't have yet. For how to assess that, again, you could perhaps use either the compare to other schools, and I wouldn't compare just to other charter schools in this case, but to all schools, and see what school drop-off trip lengths look like, or school overall VMT per student, perhaps. Or you could look and see whether the school is likely to increase total VMT or to decrease it. If it's going to draw more student drop-off travel than there was there before, or if it's going to provide a closer option and reduce the amount of VMT associated with student drop-off. So those would be where I'd start. You could also consider employee VMT. You might do that qualitatively if it looked minor compared to student drop-off VMT.
Great, thanks, Chris. Another unique project for Chris Stewart. Can you please suggest methodology for evaluating VMT of a cemetery? Origination points of trips to the cemetery are unknown.
Right. This is a little bit similar, ironically, to the school question, in that you're going to be, you're going to have, in this case, it's going to be mourners traveling to the cemetery in order to pay their respects, plus some employment vehicle travel. I'm guessing that would be substantially less, might be worth checking. But a new cemetery, there's, for any project, we don't have the points of origin, but we look at other similar projects and can make assumptions. Even for a sports stadium, you can, when we look at the environmental impacts of a sports stadium, including the VMT impacts, we do our best to figure out where we think the trips would come from. So that's no different here. We might look at other cemeteries and see what the array of what the trip patterns look like, and use that information. But as with any land use, you're going to be extrapolating from what we know, from what we can observe when you build a new project. Hope that's helpful.
The next question is from Rosanna Southern. For warehousing and industrial, would this include winery or cannabis uses in terms of agricultural development, as well as other ag land use types? The Central Valley has a lot of this land use type. Will we look into how to develop VMT thresholds or how to analyze these use types today? So I think with this webinar, can we analyze?
Right, yeah. Okay, so I can't give a definitive answer on the first part, on whether winery or cannabis uses. It depends. So what I would suggest is answering this question through the lens of what does its travel behavior look like, if you're going the route of comparing to other projects, are you comparing to other similar projects, similar in function and in travel behavior? Does it make sense? Picking a comparable projects to compare to that make sense, that could, for example, be interchanged. So wineries with other wineries, for example, or maybe it makes sense to look more broadly at wineries with other activities that might have drawn people, because people are making their under the rationale that people are making their travel choices to do something recreational that day, and they chose a winery, but they might have chose a regional park, or they might have chose some other destination. So I wouldn't formally categorize winery cannabis uses in a particular. I wouldn't put them in a particular category. That's the way I would think of them. Let me see if I'm catching the last part of this. We look at how to develop VMT thresholds or analyze these use types today. So one place I point you is to look at what the city of San Jose has done for industrial uses, and more generally, look at the work that's been done so far across the cities that have implemented VMT already. But in some cases, it might be best to develop a threshold on a case-by-case basis. So it's very hard for these land uses to provide generalized advice on how lead agencies should develop thresholds. So I will continue to provide the best guidance and thinking that I can here. But again, it's difficult to do in the abstract or in general. So hopefully that answered that question sufficiently.
Okay, great. Our next top question is from Gary Jacobs, and it is about institutional facilities like jails and prisons. He says that the projects are typically additions to existing facilities that may add 20 trips or so in a rural area, and normally are done on a mitigated negative declaration. Any suggestions on how to address this under VMT?
Right, yeah, it looks like they add 200 trips or so. The addition adds 200 trips or so. So the addition of 200 trips, the substantial evidence we provide backing a small project's a threshold, if you will, an amount of addition of trips, a number of trips added that are kind of don't need to be considered or can be streamlined. 200 is a little above that. So if you wanted to develop your own, one option is to develop your own substantial evidence showing that is less than significant. You could also analyze the project. I am assuming for a jail or prison, it's going to be, the vast majority will be commute travel. And so I would address that with the same approach that we use for office, although because the choices around citing a jail are of course different from the choices around citing office, I might not hold the jail or prison to the same significance thresholds as office, or share data, or, share average across those uses. I might look at more narrowly. Hope that addresses that question.
Okay. Next question is from Michael Phillips. How would you approach oil and gas exploration and production projects?
So I'm not terribly familiar with the sort of vehicle travel associated with oil and gas exploration and production projects. I assume, so I'll speak generally for a moment, and then hopefully the questioner can follow up if I'm missing the mark, not providing something helpful. But I'm assuming a lot of the vehicle travel is going to be heavy duty. There may be some commute travel, again, focus on that rather than the heavy duty vehicle travel. And then look at whether you're increasing total travel or decreasing it. Or if looking at commute travel, it may well be more appropriate to compare to similar projects and see whether the commute travel is greater than or less than the commute travel for similar projects, and by how much. So I'm hoping that answers that question, but please feel free to follow up.
Okay. Next question is from Beth Burks. What model would you use to calculate guest travel in the case of a hotel?
So I'm not going to specify a particular model, but I'm not sure. I'm thinking of some of the sketch models I know, so-called sketch models or spreadsheet models or statistical models, such as CaliMod. I can't recall whether the ones I know have hotel land use in them. I think they do, in which case you could turn to one of those. You could do your own assessment off of a model You could use a travel demand model if it probably would be most useful for a larger hotel, because smaller projects can get lost in the noise with travel demand models. I don't have a particular model recommendation, but I would look across, think first about the approach you're taking, and then choose a model that is most effective for that approach. And you might want to run that backwards a little bit. You might want to choose an approach that has the best available data, meaning the model, a model that has the ability to study it. So go with the approach that uses that. I hope that's a helpful answer.
Thanks, Chris. And I just want to remind everyone that we have a little under an hour left with this webinar. So continue to ask questions in the Q&A function if you have them, and upvote questions that have already been asked if you would like to see that answered with our remaining time. This video will be archived on OPR's YouTube channel, and the link for that is on OPR's SB 743 page. And thank you for joining us today. We will just keep doing this, hopefully until all the questions are answered or we run out of time. Our next top question is from Kent. How do you show that a particular VMT type is dominant, i.e. park guest VMT versus park employees VMT? Is it qualitative or based on trip generation, based on market studies, based on trip length studies, or some other type of study?
Right. I would base it fundamentally on the amount of VMT you expect. So if there is one aspect of a project that's going to generate few trips, but a lot of VMT because the trip lengths are long, I wouldn't discount that just because the trip lengths, or sorry, the number of trips are few. So I would base it on VMT. It could be a qualitative assessment. Let's see, it could be based on market studies. It depends on the scale and magnitude of the project. There might be a project for which just a quick back of the envelope calculation is appropriate. There might be a project for which, a much larger project for which a market study or an examination of vehicle travel data, big data, or travel memo data is appropriate in order to kind of set the approach there. So I hope that's helpful.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Our next question is from Dwayne Mears. It's another school question. New high schools require large parcels, take years to build, and are often sited in areas prior to planned residential being developed. So there's high VMT in the early years, but over time becomes a neighborhood school. Thoughts on how to address this situation?
Yeah, so my first thought, and Natalie or Jeannie, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong here, but CEQA requires looking at where the impact is at its maximum. If there's a big impact in year 3 and the impact is small in year 20, you still need to consider year 3. And in general, you need to look at the aggregate of you need to look across the years. But yeah, focus on the where it's at its peak. There may be opportunities to address this through plan level EIRs and tiering. So I would offer that as a possibility as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. For warehousing, Rosanna Southern has another question about that. If a development comes in that would result in more locally serving warehousing and less VMT for heavy duty trucks, shouldn't that be accounted for? For example, a warehouse near Lodi for processing wine, grapes, etc., would result in less VMT and less GHG emissions than having the trucks traveling to areas outside the county like Napa for the processing. Should we be accounting for the trucks for the warehousing?
So 2 pieces to an answer here. One, we don't need to look at trucks under 743, although the lead agency could if they if they wanted to, I suppose. We recommend against that requirement. But generally this approach, yes, absolutely. If you have a new warehouse, and this could be a new food processing facility of any kind, just like a new grocery store in a food desert can provide closer shopping, grocery shopping opportunities and reduce VMT. A processing facility or warehousing facility that's closer than existing can shorten vehicle trips. So on principle, yes, I would certainly consider the benefit that the new development is creating. And you could consider that benefit if you're not looking at heavy duty vehicle travel in your transportation analysis, you still would have the opportunity to consider that benefit in your greenhouse gases and air quality analyses, et cetera.
Thanks, Chris. Our next top question is from Jamie Kennedy. The qualitative analysis question was related to construction impacts.
Okay.
Earlier when he was asking for examples on qualitative analysis in regards to construction, what would that look like?
Okay. Construction impact. So I'm trying to piece together this question, but essentially, I guess I don't want to. I think I've already said a couple times, so I'm not sure that, and I'm not sure this is what the questioner is getting at. But construction travel, we recommend examining in a qualitative manner. That would look like characterizing the vehicle travel. Qualitative analysis can lead to a finding of less than significant impact. It can lead to a significant impact with mitigation. But it doesn't require the level of detail and modeling. So, okay, I'll try and give an example. So perhaps there is a construction project or a construction phase of a project which you're looking at, and it's going to be up a highway a little ways, and you haven't hired the construction staff yet, so you don't know where they're going to come from. Now, if you're doing a quantitative analysis, you could take the time to make those assumptions, and they'll come from, we know from other similar construction projects are likely to come from these locations, and there would be this much VMT. Qualitative analysis might just characterize more loosely, maybe use some numbers but fewer. But you might, and you might, if you came to a significant impact, or we're looking at it was going to be a significant impact, a mitigation or something to build into the project, might be to provide a van pool that goes up the highway from a more central location that would be expected to reduce VMT. So that's kind of a rough, quick example of a qualitative analysis of construction. Hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Chris. So you've already mentioned Disneyland and stadiums. That probably what prompted David Kennedy's question. What is OPR's recommendation for large size attractions such as amusement parks, convention centers, arenas, and stadiums?
Right. So I would look, we don't have, aside from to the extent to which these are considered a retail project, we don't have explicit recommendation in our technical advisory for these sorts of uses. But for each of them, we would suggest starting, or I would suggest starting with the method for retail. So look at the vehicle travel without the project, and then look at the vehicle travel with the project. So for example, this was done for the Kings Arena, which is fun to mention because it was streamlined with the same bill that 743 carried 743 forward, or it was SB 743 that streamlined it, the same law that we're talking about today, also changed CEQA. But essentially, there was an analysis done. There was a suburban arena, and it was being replaced with the downtown arena. And the project proponents, the transportation analysis consisted of looking at actually big data and seeing where people were traveling from to that suburban arena, and then making the assumption that those same people were going to go to the new arena, and would it be closer or would it be further? Would they be reducing VMT or increasing it? And not a big surprise for a shift to a downtown arena that would be reducing VMT. That particular law, this is separate from the portion 743 we're talking about, but that particular law required a certain amount of VMT reduction, and they had to do a little more work to get there. But on the natural, it was going to reduce vehicle travel. So recommend taking a similar approach generally for large size attractions, amusement parks, convention centers, stadiums. Look at the VMT without the project, look at the VMT with the project, and that delta is what you are addressing. If the delta is negative, you have a less than significant impact. If the delta is positive, that might be what you're looking to mitigate.
Thanks, Chris. The next question is from Joanna Chan. A follow-up to the hotel question, is there a definition for dominant use, or do lead agencies define that themselves?
The latter, lead agency would define that themselves. I would base that generally on the amount of vehicle travel is when I was considering what the dominant use would be.
Okay, thanks. The next top question is from Mike Brady. Many existing industrial warehousing areas have a specific plan that describes road improvements and sometimes new or improved interchanges as mitigation measures for traffic impacts. When one of those improvements, say a new interchange that would pull industrial traffic away from other city streets and interchanges, is proposed, what approach would you recommend to do the VMT analysis for the road project?
Right. So for road projects generally, we recommend using essentially the same method, and this is spelled out in the technical advisory, the same method as we recommend for retail. So looking at the total amount of vehicle travel with and without the project. So I'm gonna look at the question again to see if there's another piece of it that I need to get at. Complex question.
Yes.
Warehousing areas have specific. Right. So many projects have, or many plans or projects have, in the past specified LOS mitigation because most jurisdictions use LOS. And of course, we're shifting away from that to VMT. So that would no longer be the sort of mitigation you would see under CEQA. Those improvements, a new interchange. So right, if you were looking at the transportation project itself, that's simply the method we recommend, looking at whether the transportation facility increases or decreases vehicle travel. We have a list that we provided in the technical advisory of sorts of roadway projects that we would not expect to induce significant vehicle travel from the flavor of the sort of improvement that's described here. It seems like it would be likely to fit in there, although I can't say for sure. But check that list for projects that we recommend not bothering to do a VMT analysis, assuming that it won't increase VMT substantially.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Next question is from Philip Lee. In regards to the freight warehouse question, would it also apply to ocean and land ports as well? In that you have to do the analysis for light duty trucks and automobiles, but not heavy duty trucks.
Yeah, in a word, correct. That's for freight warehouse, for any land uses, the transportation effects need not consider heavy duty vehicle travel.
Next top question from Bob Brown. In reference to the earlier question about construction VMT at a wastewater treatment plant, what is the concern for short-term impacts unless it is a construction company that has to travel long distances? So essentially, why are we concerned about the short-term construction impacts while wastewater treatment plant is being improved and upgraded.
Yeah, and I would say that we're not, from a 743 perspective, we're not too concerned about those impacts. You know, a lead agency, again, under our recommendations, could readily turn to a qualitative analysis. And because they're short-term, there's all the more reason to find qualitatively or quantitatively that those impacts are not significant. And yes, as the questioner points out, if the one impact that you might see is if the workers needed to travel quite a long distance to the site.
Great. Okay, so next question is back to schools. Nicole Hoke asks, can a neighborhood elementary school be screened out as a locally serving use?
So I would say that could be possible, but it would be important to establish for the jurisdiction to establish some substantial evidence that providing a neighborhood elementary school reduces vehicle travel by taking trips that might go to another elementary school that's further away, for example. So I wouldn't say that that our recommendation for locally serving retail, holding locally serving retail less than significant, would just automatically apply to locally serving or neighborhood elementary school, but that it may be that can be established, perhaps even readily, by the lead agency, and then that such a presumption could be created at that level. If there are, and this is a bigger picture, if we do see land use categories or types of development that are above and beyond what we have provided guidance for in the technical advisory, the technical advisory is a legal document, and if we see that there is a land use category that generally speaking tends to always reduce VMT, then we can ultimately add that and the substantial evidence that others have found to the technical advisory, and so perhaps save others the work of proving it in each lead agency. So as we go forward, we hope to be able to provide those sorts of essentially aggregated help, I guess, to lead agencies across the state.
Great, thanks, Chris. And if we do update the technical advisory, we will send out an e-blast about that. So
We'll let you know.
yes, you don't have to keep checking back. We'll let you know if we update it in the near future. All right, the next question is from Kent. How would you handle an inpatient drug rehabilitation center? Would the dominant VMT be from employees?
So you might know better than I do, but that would be my guess, that the dominant VMT would come from employees, given the word inpatient makes me think that the patients are not doing a lot of travel to the facility. So that would be my guess as well.
Unless there's any potential visitors or...
True, visitor VMT could potentially be significant, or could potentially be, I shouldn't use the word significant, this is a CEQA meaning, could be sufficient to consider.
All right, great. The next question is from H. Johnson, and we might need some additional clarification on this. The question is, are there any other land uses for which a VMT transportation analysis is not applicable?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I understand the question. Oh, are there any other land uses? So other meaning not retail, residential, or office, for which a VMT transportation analysis is not applicable. My short answer is no, that the VMT analysis applies to all project types, including all land use projects. Yeah, so I'll leave it there, but follow up if I'm not answering your question. Thanks.
Okay. All right, our next top question from Pranesh: if heavy duty truck trips are excluded from the industrial warehouse transportation impacts, the VMT per employee CEQA impact would be agnostic to the size of the project. For example, a 200,000 square foot warehouse could have the same VMT per employee as a 2 million square foot warehouse.
Correct. So correct. So the approach we recommend for employment centers for office is intentionally agnostic to project size. And what we're focusing on, again, this goes back to that Newhall Ranch decision, where we're focused on the efficiency. We're not looking to limit growth, but we're looking to see how efficient that growth is. So this would be another example of that. Thanks for the question.
So our next question is back to schools. I think that's our theme of the day, schools and trucks. Mary Beatty asks about the analysis for an expansion of a school district sphere of influence in SOI.
School district sphere of influence. Okay, this is a I'm not terribly familiar with this, so let me think it through. If you increase the sphere of influence for a school district, then what is the vehicle travel? What is going to be the change in vehicle travel that results from that? That would be the question. I don't think I know enough to answer it any further than that. But that's the beginning. That's just the general approach. Yeah, I'm afraid that's all I can provide without knowing more. Feel free to follow up though.
This is Jeannie. I'll just quickly chime in that generally speaking, not just specific to this kind of SOI expansion, but generally speaking, lead agencies may want to take a look at any growth-induced impacts when you expand SOIs. So there could be some VMT associated with that.
Thanks, Jeannie. That makes sense.
Okay.
All right, our next question is from Patrick Tuck. Can you address parking lots, parking garages, RV parking projects, and how to do those VMT calculations?
Right. So parking lots, I would recommend using the, picking off the top of my head, but I would recommend using the, generally, the approach of does adding the parking lot increase vehicle travel or decrease vehicle travel. And we know that in many cases, in adding parking, we know that generally speaking, where parking is constrained, which is assuming parking is constrained if you're adding parking, that you'll draw more vehicle travel. So I would look to the research that's been done on that. The city of San Francisco has done some research on that. And there may be others at this point. I'm not intimately familiar with that. RV parking projects, I would probably do the same. That might be something that would have low enough vehicle travel if people are just going to get their RV, once a month. It might be something that has low enough vehicle travel associated with it. It might make sense to study to study in a qualitative fashion. So those are a few thoughts on that.
Great, thanks, Chris. And the next question is about truck park-ins.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the same? I'm not familiar with truck park-ins.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. And I don't know if it's truck parking and there's or if it's just truck. It's something I'm not familiar with. Generally speaking, if it's for trucks, it's not something that would need to be considered under 743. So I'll leave that at that, and please follow up if I haven't gotten it what you're after.
Okay, so Jamie Kennedy, if you want to provide more details about truck park-ins, please let us know. Our next question is from Daniel Breeden. Could a project use a phased approach to mitigating VMT? In other words, the transit center won't come online for 2 years, and the parking will be phased out or reduced correspondingly.
That makes sense to me. Let me know, Jeannie or Natalie, if you have a more legal-based opinion on that. But I think that would be something that you would be able to do under CEQA that would be appropriate.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. Jeannie, I don't know if you have anything you would like to add, but it seems like the mitigation would be tied to the impact and would change as the impact changed throughout time.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Thanks.
Okay. The next question is from Baldwin. How do you reconcile the difference in VMT draw between specific sites? For example, a winery in Temecula will have a different VMT generation than the same winery in downtown LA. When lacking a reliable source of data that is consistent to a region, how do you come up with that number for the analysis?
Right. So this illustrates an important point, which is that location is quite important when assessing VMT. In fact, there's a good amount of research on the relationship, and mostly of the regular land uses, the residential, retail, office, the ones we've provided guidance for. But the implications go beyond those land uses. There's a good amount of research on the land use characteristics and land use and transportation characteristics and their effect on vehicle travel. It's called the D variable research, or they're called the Ds for shorthand. For example, the effect of residential density on land use, or the effect of I can't remember what the D words are for all of them, because some of the words are kind of manipulated to start with D, but the connectivity of a network, right? Is it a grid where people can get straight to where they want to go, or is it a loops and lollipops cul-de-sac kind of neighborhood where people might have to travel a ways to get somewhere that's close as the crow flies? So there's research on, I don't know what we're up to, but it's at least 8 of these kind of effects, land use effect, and how big an effect it has on VMT. And the largest effect of all, kind of far and away, is what's your regional location? How close are you to job center? Are you near the center of the region, or are you way on the outskirts of it? And that will tend to be true for many land uses. There'll be different patterns of where you are in the region and its effect on vehicle travel for different land uses. But where you are located within a region is going to have usually the biggest effect on the amount of vehicle travel associated with your project. That said, let me look back at the question to make sure I'm answering it. So I guess there's not a reconciliation. It's actually that is a driving, regional location is a driving force for VMT. And so maybe this is kind of a trip generation question that, well, trip generation might look similar from a similar use in a central location versus a peripheral location, but VMT is likely to be different. And that's mostly because the difference in trip length, right? VMT is trip generation times trip length. And although the trip generation might be similar for the same use in different locations, trip length may be very different. So make sure to look at trip length. And seeing that there's concern about lacking a reliable data source. Again, I mean, you find to use the best data available. Base your CEQA doesn't require perfection. It requires you to make the best effort you can using the models that are in existence and the data that's in existence. And those both are improving quickly, but there are also, they're not infinite in their reach. Okay, hope that's helpful.
All right, thanks, Chris. Our next top question is about is from Kara Higgelson. How might you address VMT impacts from a landfill project or a landfill expansion, having trash trucks, transfer trucks, employees, and visitors?
Right. So the trash trucks and transfer trucks wouldn't need to be analyzed. So you'd be looking at employees and visitors. And you could look at that facility maybe through either lens of comparing it to similar facilities across the region, or looking at it absolutely whether it increases, whether it would lead to an increase in vehicle travel or a decrease in those types of vehicle travel.
All right, the next top question is from Robert Sarmiento. Can you discuss places of worship? Should they be treated similar to local versus regional retail?
I would say, yeah, that definitely would make sense as an approach to treat them with the same method as with retail. So a new place of worship, are people driving further to get to it than they did before their earlier places of worship, or does it provide a closer location for them to travel to is a closer location, and therefore more accessible and lower VMT. So yeah, I would suggest treating it similar. I don't. So the local versus regional retail, I'll just take that as does it reduce or increase vehicle travel, which I think is a good lens through which to look at it. I don't know whether or not it would be appropriate to develop. You'd have to look at the data, whether or not the evidence, whether or not it would be reasonable to create any sort of presumption.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. The next top question is from Hasib. For a new fulfillment center type land use focused on local delivery rather than regional, could there be a presumption of less than significance, since in theory this type of land use would be distributing packages closer to their final destination and therefore reduce overall VMT?
Let me make sure I get this question right. Local delivery rather than regional. That's interesting. I mean, you possibly, if you could show that this type of development generally reduces vehicle travel, then it might be appropriate to develop evidence for backing a presumption of less than significance. Keeping in mind, of course, that oftentimes delivery vehicles are heavy trucks, and we don't need to consider those. Employee commute travel might be less if the facility. A key question might be, is it replacing delivery that was further away and therefore generated more VMT, be it commute VMT, presumably. So just taking a step back generally, the presumptions of less than significant impact are not something that we sort of bestow on certain land uses. They are just where we have evidence or very clear reason to believe that a type of project, a certain type of project, will generate less than significant VMT. We recommend applying a presumption to streamline those projects. But you still need that backing evidence, or you still need to do the legwork. You still need to show your work on why. Presumption relies on substantial evidence.
Thank you, Chris. I would also point out that there are presumptions contained in the CEQA guideline itself for SB 743 for projects that are within a half mile of an existing major transit stop and a high quality transit corridor. And then I believe also projects that reduce VMT So that is called out explicitly in the CEQA guidelines. All right, new project type. This next question is from Patty Nahill. What category would public facilities such as libraries and community centers be placed in?
What category? Oh, maybe the question is which method would we consider using, the compare to other, comparing to others, or the looking at the total amount of VMT. For libraries, I could see it going, I could see using either, comparing to other libraries. Is this one attracting more or less VMT? If it were, especially if it were a larger library, worth running a travel demand model for, does it reduce overall VMT or increase? And then a community center, I would generally recommend looking at whether it increases or decreases VMT overall. So I would first consider that method. Thanks.
Chris, next question is from Matthew Jew. How would VMT be analyzed for daycare centers and preschools where the trips are along the way between home and work?
Right. So this is the pass-by question again. So how far out of the way did someone need to travel in order to access this center? You don't need to. Would that kind of delta, that increase in vehicle travel, would be what you would want to look at, rather than the whole trip or tour for a project like this. For any project that's essentially more pass by or is generally associated with another trip. Now it might be that it might be not a pass by trip that the daycare center or preschool creates. It might be that people make a separate trip or go out of their way rather than on their way to this facility, and that should be reflected if that's the case.
Great, thanks, Chris. So next question is from Rosanna Southern. She missed the earlier answer about hotels. So can we provide that response again about how you would analyze it based on VMT per employee or change in VMT due to visitorship? Or do you look at whichever is the highest to determine what to use?
For hotels, I could see using either, particularly say you were focused, say it was a hotel that simply just has guests and employees. It might make sense to focus on guest VMT or guest and employee VMT, and then it might make sense to compare to other hotels, compare that VMT to that of other hotels. For a hotel that was more of a convention center or had a real significant component of visitors, it might make sense to look at it through the total VMT lens that we recommend for retail. So looking at whether the project would increase VMT in the area overall or decrease it. You could also bifurcate those two pieces of the project and look at it through both lenses. Let's see, would we look at whichever is the highest VMT? So yeah, and one more option is to just look at the dominant use and perhaps address other vehicle travel associated with in a qualitative fashion. So those are some options.
Great, thanks, Chris. So the next top question is in response to the earlier question we received about oil and gas projects. And you had asked for more details about what exactly that entailed. So Michael Phillips has provided some additional details and says that most traffic is heavy duty truck related. The development phase would be construction of new wells and associated infrastructure, and a small portion would be employee commute. Operations would primarily be employee commute with some heavy duty truck traffic for specific tasks like testing, maintenance, and repair activities. So for operations, the majority of travel would be employee commute.
Great. So yeah, once again, no need to consider the heavy duty vehicle travel in your transportation analysis. That would be considered in your other analyses, your other impact categories under CEQA. And yes, the thing to look at is employee commute travel. Thanks.
New question, would OPR consider VMT from vehicle fleet, for example, CHP or conservation camps, to be included in the project calculations?
Yes, where the vehicle travel is light duty vehicle travel, we would suggest including fleet vehicle VMT.
The next question is from Wesley. Do we need more studies aimed at improving VMT assumptions using technology like GPS tracking and data from Google, Waze, Uber, and Lyft? Do we need more data to answer these questions?
Yeah, I mean, yes, we let me put it this way. Can we move forward with the data we have on this? Absolutely. There's is data increasing, the data available increasing very quickly? Yes, there are new sources of data coming online, particularly big data, that are quickly becoming more available and, to my understanding, more affordable. And then there are new, there are also new ways of getting around. We've in recent years seen Uber and Lyft show up and become significant in some locations, and there are forthcoming further further changes to how we get around coming our way. Big one is when automated vehicles become viable and start driving us around. That'll change our travel patterns really substantially. For all of these, we're going to need to keep track. We're going to need to study. We're going to need to update our models and our guidance, and we have every expectation to do so. We'll certainly be updating our guidance as those come along. But we're already seeing both academia and the transportation consulting community doing a lot of work to keep up with these changes and examine the effects they have to provide more information for future analyses. Thanks for that question.
So next question is from Kent, and I believe we've already addressed the first part, but maybe we can restate this again. For heavy duty truck facilities like landfills, where most of the VMT is from heavy trucks, are only the light duty vehicle miles traveled, the employees analyzed, and I think the question we could repeat, are heavy duty truck vehicle miles traveled analyzed as part of some separate analysis?
Right, so yes, heavy duty. So first, you're not required or advised to study heavy duty vehicle truck VMT under 743, but those impacts will be considered under other impact categories such as air quality or greenhouse gas emissions. So it'll be important to examine those impacts there. I think that answers that question.
All right, 2 more questions to go in our final 12 minutes here. Zachary.
That's another.
Yeah, there's time. We do want to leave some time
Excited to.
for wrap up.
Zach. Oh, there goes. Oh, it's just a thank you.
Just a thank you. Thanks, Rosanna. Zachary Matley has a question. For many of the land uses discussed today where total VMT would be considered, quantitative VMT analysis would be speculative as the customer base is unknown and variable, i.e. when adding a new daycare, place of worship, library, or community center. Would a qualitative assessment describing the reasoning behind presumption of why the use would have a less than significant VMT impact suffice in these cases?
Yeah, it's hard to answer in general. And I think I would debate a little bit the characterization of quantitative VMT analysis being speculative. I would tend to reframe that as, again, CEQA doesn't require perfection. You're not going to, you may not know exactly the amount of VMT a project is going to generate. There's going to be some uncertainty. You know, I mean, as we were using LOS, we oftentimes reported results with a lot of decimal points of precision. But really, there was quite a bit of uncertainty in those results as well. We believe that VMT, because it's a more aggregate figure, is actually going to allow for better accuracy than we had with LOS. Eventually, substantially better accuracy, we think, and a good amount better just out the gate. So I would suggest that it not considering it speculative to look at the VMT from a project when there's some unknowns, but you are doing, as CEQA asks, the best you can to gather the relevant data. Sometimes you'll need to extrapolate, sometimes you'll need to interpolate, do so and give the best answer and show your work. And let me make sure I'm capturing the last part of the question. What a qualitative assessment. So yeah, in some cases, a qualitative assessment will be appropriate as well. But I wouldn't say that when you don't have exact numbers means that a quantitative analysis is impossible or speculative. That's still, you can use the best information you have, even if that information isn't perfect. And thanks for that question.
Thanks, Chris. Similarly, Philip Ho asks, what makes a VMT analysis legally defensible?
Yeah, a very similar question. It's, again, there's a lot to say to this in general. I mean, the VMT analysis, the approach is called for in SB 743, which is the law, and in the CEQA guidelines now. So there's that. Again, CEQA doesn't require perfection, but it requires the best, an honest effort and using the best available information. And that's going to look a lot different for different projects. Some have a very good and detailed information available. Some have less detailed information available, and will require a little bit more interpolating or extrapolating. But it doesn't mean that we can't get valuable information towards understanding what the impacts of the project will be, which is CEQA's fundamental purpose. Thanks for that question.
Thank you. All right, a new question from Rob Swierk. For light industrial, if it can be demonstrated that the users, the employees would be similar to office, mainly on 9 to 5 schedules, would it be reasonable to use the office analysis method, VMT per employee, compared to a threshold, and assume that the same VMT reductions, for example, from CAPCOA, apply to an office project would also apply to this light industrial project?
Yeah, I mean, not having the project in the details of the project example in front of me, that certainly seems reasonable to assume. And then there's a judgment call on whether to, if all those things are similar enough, should the threshold just be the same, of significance just be the same, or is there a reason to distinguish it? And I would make that decision by whether whether those characteristics were similar enough. Yeah, from the information presented in the question, that I would generally say, yeah, that seems right to me.
Great. All right, last question. Perfect timing. Thanks for waiting, Kirk. Your question is related to the park and recreation facilities. What about if the project was providing additional parking in a parking structure?
So I'm assuming that no one would go to the expense of building a parking structure if parking were not constrained, meaning that providing parking in a structure is going to provide the opportunity or draw for more people to drive to a location. So that could well attract more vehicle travel, more VMT. I think that gets to that question. We can hold a minute or two and leave space for if there's a follow-up on that question or others before wrapping up. So let's just give a little bit of space, minute or two. If people have any other question, they're thinking about whether to bravely type it into the question box or not, feel free to right now. And if not, wrap up. While we're doing that, I will put another slide up. You've seen this before if you were on earlier, but we have a populated, I should say, we have a topical office hour next week, same time, same place, covering legal issues of tiering, timing, etc. Going to be the focus, and then a couple more office hours, and we'll get back to you soon through the CEQA guidelines listserv on what we're going to focus on or whether we're going to leave those open for any sorts of questions.
To that same time, same place as June 10th at 10 a.m. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm just scared you don't hear me.
We do. We do. And you're nicely placed in the fog of the Golden Gate Bridge behind you. It's neat. Some of it comes over your shoulder here and there. It's the
all right. I just hope that I'm there. I'm doing my best to be here and support you guys. You guys have done a great job. And yeah, June 10th, 10 a.m. to 12 noon, we'll be talking about tiering and other legal topics. And for the 17th and the 24th, we'll be determining those. We'll be determining that based on questions that we receive. You can send those questions to sb743questions@opr.ca.gov. You can continue to register for the webinar at opr.ca.gov. And just apologize for that technical difficulty at the very top of the webinar.
Natalie stood in for you well. Thanks, Will, though, for opening us up and wrapping us up. Thanks, everyone, for joining today.
Yeah, one last thing before you go. Someone asked about where the previous webinars are available. So can we give that address before we sign off?
So oh, go ahead, Will. Okay. On our website, OPR's website, there is a little in the upper left corner, the landing page is opr.ca.gov. There's a little YouTube symbol. Click on that and that'll get you to our YouTube channel. And that is where the recordings of the office hours as well as the webinars we did previously live. Forgive us for the recordings are not the most polished. They, in some cases, the webinars, they include some preparation time. Just know that and fast forward your way to the content. But please make use of those. There's a lot of good information in them. Thanks for asking.
Great. So with that, I think we can conclude.